From the world of politics.
I think President Biden has put himself in a very difficult situation now. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult for him to justify sending troops.
To the world of business.
We've got a lot of work underway and looking forward to getting that new tunnel in. This program is unprecedented. We're talking about a massive multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar program.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. President Biden announced a first round of sanctions against Russia yesterday, with the prospect of perhaps more to come, depending on what Russian President Putin does next in Ukraine. For The View from Washington, we welcome now Joe Matthew. He's host, of course, of Sound On Bloomberg Radio every day of the week. So, Joe, how does it look right now from Washington?
Well, I'll tell you, David, after those sanctions were announced yesterday, this White House is feeling pressure from allies on Capitol Hill to our allies in Europe. The president rolling out the sanctions that we talked about here and you heard and saw live on Bloomberg TV and radio that are aimed at two of Russia's largest financial institutions and several oligarchs, but a far cry from what a lot of folks have been calling for here in Washington now for weeks, including Republicans on Capitol Hill who did not want the administration to wait. And now some Democrats, in fact, many are joining that chorus, including Senator Chris Coons from Joe Biden's home state of Delaware to the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Menendez, who was on the verge, as he said, of coming up with his own legislation on sanctions. He spoke on CNN this morning saying what we cannot have is another Munich moment, which says a lot from a Democrat here. And these calls may be answered soon. This is a White House, as we heard from President Biden yesterday, David, that expects Russia to continue moving into Ukraine. And if that is the case, it will be answered by further sanctions. We heard from Press Secretary Jen Psaki on this again yesterday, saying, quote, that the U.S. is ready to press a button to take action on another round. We'll see if that happens today, David. This is clearly a White House that is reserving some leverage for what it fears will be continued aggression from Russia.
And, Joe, I wonder if it may need that leverage. We hope it won't, but whether it mean not only because of possible action on the ground in Ukraine, but also we had the Russian Foreign Ministry earlier today, as you know, say, OK, now it's our turn. We're going to come back at you and punish you, United States.
Well, we'll see how far that goes. And of course, tomorrow there will be no meeting between Russia's foreign minister and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Apparently, talks are off here. And so it's really just a question of when likely these more severe sanctions are put in place. But David, we've heard weeks of threats of crippling, devastating sanctions. We simply haven't seen that yet.
Okay, Joe, really great to have you with us. As always, that's Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. You can listen to Joe every single day at 5 p.m. on his radio program, Sound On. That's at 5 p.m., once again, Eastern Time. One of the key questions being asked in Washington and in European capitals is whether there is still room for a diplomatic resolution of the Ukraine crisis. For his answer to that question, welcome now Sir Peter Westmacott. He's the former British ambassador to the United States. Earlier, Sir Peter served Her Majesty's service in France and in Turkey as ambassador as well. So, Sir Peter, thanks so much for being with us. What about the question, how do we know whether there's still room for diplomacy? As we just heard, and you know, we have our own Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's not going to meet, it appears, with Mr. Lavrov from Russia.
Yeah. Well, David, it's good to be with you again. Thanks for giving me the chance to say something. I think the impression that we have here in Europe is pretty similar to what Joe was describing in Washington. That is to say that governments, the European Union, but also the United Kingdom, now outside the European Union, have been scrambling to come up with sanctions in response to the first stage, if you like, of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And that's okay so far, but there's a sense in the British Parliament and there's a sense in some of the more critical media that this isn't enough, because after all, the sanctions that you apply are supposed to make a price of what you've done so far not worth paying, and also to deter you from doing anything more. And the signs are that so far, what they've seen, the Russians, in terms of the pain inflicted by Western sanctions, have not been enough, certainly to make him go back on what he's already done. And it doesn't look like it's enough to stop him going further. So there is a sense, well, where's the rest of the sanctions and what are you waiting for? And that's part of the political background. That said, I think it was pretty remarkable that the European Union, all 27 members of it, managed to agree yesterday to a pretty tough package of sanctions. That's good. And the Germans, who were reluctant to turn off the tap of the new Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia have done so. So there is some pretty firm messaging coming from here. But I think that if we want to stop further military action, the diplomacy, to answer your question specifically, has to ratchet itself up a few notches so that Putin begins to say to himself, you know what, maybe this isn't worth going ahead with.
So, Peter, you mentioned the 27 countries in the European Union, and I really wonder, from the point of view of Europe, as you're over there, is part of the reason perhaps President Biden is not going farther faster because he needs to keep everybody on board, and if he went too far too fast, he'd lose some of that unanimity that is clearly his priority in dealing with President Putin?
He's clearly attached a great deal of importance to working with allies. And, you know, from European capitals, that is a very welcome change from the atmosphere that used to be around the time of his predecessor. So I think you're right. He will not want to get far ahead of the others. But I think Europeans and the British are being criticized for being a bit behind the Europeans, in fact, although Boris Johnson has said we're doing more than anyone. And it's not really what the objective observers are saying here. I think that everybody will want to be moving in step as the sanctions are ratcheted up. And I think they need to, given that the intel and all the commentary from the foreign ministers, whether it's Tony Blinken or whether it's Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, even the French now, suggests that the Russians, the Kremlin, are on the point of going even further with material military movements across the border into the whole Donbass region.
As a diplomat, do you believe that President Putin at this point has conveyed a sense that actually he is open to a diplomatic resolution here? Or does it look from his conduct that basically he's intent on doing something in Ukraine, whatever goes on with diplomacy?
It's a great question, David, because there's plenty of technical intelligence. You know, how many tanks are there? How many airplanes? How many helicopters? How many hospital units? What about the satellite photography? All that is pretty remarkable. But what we don't have is a camera inside his head. And some of the foreign diplomats and leaders who have seen President Putin in recent times have been saying privately, he's not the same guy. And I think if you watched, as many of us did, live, that extraordinary speech he gave a couple of nights ago, you know, it was kind of incoherent rambling of somebody who was raging rather than somebody who was necessarily calculating in a rational way. But of course, we never quite know what's theater and what is the real person. So do we know what decisions the president of the Russian Federation has taken? No, I don't think we do. Do we see very, very clearly that an awful lot of military movements and preparations have been made to permit a major military intervention in neighboring sovereign Ukraine? Yes, we do.
So, Peter, I wonder what the larger stakes may be here. I mean, the stakes are enormous for Ukraine, without a doubt, and for much of Western Europe. But are there larger stakes even than that? Here at Bloomberg, we talk a lot about moral hazard in the financial area, where if somebody takes a risk and they don't get punished for it, then, in fact, it really damages the overall system. What is the rest of the world making of this? If, in fact, Vladimir Putin can move into Ukraine in one shape or the other and not suffer consequences. It looks like in 2014, when he took Crimea, the consequences were not all that severe.
Well, there were none. And I think the rest of us were aware that we weren't necessarily caught sleeping, but we didn't react strongly enough for him to realize that he couldn't go and do it again. We'd had Georgia before that and South Ossetia before that. You know, there's the old Leninist phrase that you probe with the bayonet, and as long as it's flesh, you push, and when you hit steel, you stop. And so being trained by the KGB, Putin is somebody who doesn't really think he has to stop until he's got no choice. And he doesn't respect weakness. And so he will keep going until, your point, moral hazard is such that the price isn't worth paying. At the moment, he does not seem to have calculated that. What does it mean more generally at the geostrategic level? I think if we do not find a way of rolling this back, or at least making a huge price to be paid by the Kremlin, by the president of Russia, then it's kind of free for all. Not quite free for all, but it does mean that our Western alliances, our attempts to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, freedoms that we all hold dear, look a bit fragile, a bit frayed at the edge. So we do have to make a stand. For a while, we had China with us, saying that the territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations was absolutely indivisible, and Ukraine was no exception. But that was at Munich about 5 days ago, and after Putin's announcement 2 days ago, they changed their tune. So we haven't got the Chinese with us at the moment, but we do seem to have, you know, most of the rest of the, shall we say, democracies around the world firmly with us. But we have to show that we mean it, because otherwise it's going to be open season for autocrats around the world who think they can help themselves to neighboring territory.
Indeed. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure having you with us. That's Sir Peter Westmacott, former British ambassador to the United States. A programming note now, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba will be joining Bloomberg later this afternoon in an exclusive interview that's going to come up in the 3 p.m. Eastern Time hour. Coming up, we talk with the Authority on Energy Markets. He is Dan Jurgen of IHS Markit about what the Ukraine crisis could mean for oil and gas. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Now keeping you up to date with news from right around the world, here's First Word with Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, David. Ukraine is moving towards declaring a nationwide state of emergency that would allow Ukrainian officials to impose restrictions on movement and media following Russia's recognition of 2 self-proclaimed republics in Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Biden's first round of sanctions on Russia was seen as underwhelming. Members of Congress from both parties want him to do more. China, meanwhile, expressed opposition to the Russian sanctions. A foreign ministry spokesperson criticized the U.S. for inflaming the Ukraine crisis, suggesting its support for NATO's expansion left President Putin with few options. Several Ukrainian government and bank websites suffered cyber attacks today. Ukraine's digital transformation minister says websites of the cabinet of ministers, foreign ministry and parliament do not open. The press offices acknowledged problems with the sites but didn't give a reason. With President Biden's environmental legislation stalled, Democrats and activists want the White House to declare a climate emergency. The tactic would unlock executive powers and allow the president to shut down crude oil exports, suspend offshore drilling, and redirect funding for clean energy projects. Former President Trump used a similar step and diverted billions to build a southern border wall after Congress refused to appropriate the funds. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Energy is very much at the heart of the Ukraine crisis, with German Chancellor Scholz saying yesterday that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will not go forward, at least at present, and the price of Brent crude spiking up over $96 a barrel. I think it hit 98 actually today. To explain the potential consequences for the energy sector, we welcome now the authority on the subject. He's Daniel Jurgen. He's IHS Markit Vice Chairman, and he is the author, most recently, of the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan, thank you so much for being with us. Let me start, first of all, what the markets are or are not telling us about this crisis. We know the price of oil has gone up, but what about the futures market? Is it indicating what the markets at least think about how long this crisis will last?
Well, in the near term, it is certainly doing that. Some say we're going to have over $100 oil for much of the year. But I think right now the focus is really this crisis and the threat, what it means to the flow of oil. We've had $100 oil in the past, but it has become very symbolic as this crisis intensifies.
And what about natural gas? Because that's of the essence, particularly in Western Europe, Germany, places like that.
Well, natural gas is already 4 times normal price, and it's not interrupted. And one thing, David, that's been really important that has actually helped keep the lights on in Europe is, in fact, the exports of U.S. LNG. So the thing we just heard in that news report that some people want to stop the exports of U.S. oil and gas, it would cripple Europe, and it would be a gift to Vladimir Putin.
And we have not seen sanctions as yet that would affect the energy sector. We saw some sanctions yesterday from President Biden. We did see, of course, German Chancellor Scholz say it doesn't look like we're going to go forward with Nord Stream 2 now. But what are the potential sanctions that could affect the energy industry beyond Nord Stream 2?
Well, actually, I was thinking that as you were saying that in fact, what the Germans have just done with Nord Stream 2 is a sanction on that $11 billion pipeline, because the indications are that it won't go forward now. And that's very significant to Russia. But beyond that, the sanctions are focused on financial institutions, on export controls, and on individuals and their families. And they've at least tried in the administration to carve out energy, because that would hit not only Russia, but could hit the Europeans as well, or would hit the Europeans as well. But I think what the markets are also saying is that, sanctions are not a surgical instrument. They're a blunt instrument, and you'll see people overcomply, and you already see people shifting their purchases of oil to try and deal with potential disruptions. But that's one of the biggest problems that's been in making these sanctions is how do you have sanctions that don't disrupt the flow of oil and gas that Europe depends upon and doesn't send oil prices not to $100 a barrel, but by accident to $150 a barrel.
When it comes to energy, Dan, I'm curious about the role, if any, China could play in this. We remember back in 2014, actually, when there were sanctions imposed after Crimea. Actually, China stepped up and loaned a fair amount of money for a pipeline to Russia. Is there a prospect here that Russia could increase its energy transactions with China to relieve some of the pressure?
Yes, absolutely, particularly that they now built up an LNG business. Putin was just back he was back in Beijing just like he was after 2014, although it was Shanghai at that point, and has signed a new natural gas deal. And I think China is Russia's big back door in terms of sanctions. And the China of 2022 is much different and much larger than the China of 2014. So one of the things that the sanctions do is push Russia and China together, just as the Russians and Putin has succeeded in pushing NATO together.
In the meantime, in your book, The New Map, you talk about President Putin having a goal of reasserting Russia as a major global force, in part on the back of oil and gas. Does this crisis at least hold out the possibility that he might not be able to get there, at least in any time soon, given where we're headed?
Well, I think he wants to show and look at all the statesmen, all the people who go and see him, that he is the player. The attention was shifting to China. Now it's very much back on him and Russia and what he says and so forth. But I mean, Russia is an energy superpower, but the power of that weapon or that position, let's call it that position, has really been blunted by the development of LNG, and particularly U.S. LNG, which has turned out to be a strategic asset for the country. So, as you were talking with Sir Peter just now, Putin wants to be a world power, but he's now in a certain way gambled in such a way that, what's his way out and what are the consequences going to be for him, particularly if fighting erupts between Ukrainian forces in the Donbass and the new Russian peacekeeping. We will enter a new level. And there is some sense in which he's seeking a provocation to put all those 150,000 or 170,000 troops to work.
Dan, as you know so well, it's really tricky trying to draw long-term consequences when you're in the middle of a crisis. But you know the global energy market so well. At this point, can you anticipate whether or not there could be long-term consequences in the energy market from this crisis?
Well, I think it will. I think there's going to be a revaluation of energy security. There's been kind of an amnesia about energy security, just taken for granted because the United States, for instance, is much more energy secure in the past. I think it's going to be back on the agenda, and I think that's one consequence, and that means diversification of resources. Already we're hearing the Germans talking about building new receiving terminals for LNG, which they haven't done before, to diversify. So you go back to what Winston Churchill said on the eve of the First World War: security is in diversification, in variety, and that's going to be a consequence of this particular crisis.
And apply that analysis specifically to President Biden, his energy policy here. He was really moving away from fossil fuels. We now have some people. We had a Republican senator from Tennessee yesterday saying he's got to open the spigot back up for the United States for our energy security. Could it change President Biden's energy plans?
Well, I think it already has, whereas there was not much interest at all in dialogue with the oil and gas industry. There certainly is now. The Secretary of Energy in December actually asked the domestic industry to increase production. But, and of course, what they're really looking at is gasoline prices when the November elections come around, and trying to have more supply. In two of his speeches recently, President Biden has warned of higher energy prices. And so on the one hand, putting a freeze on doing permits, on the other hand, saying we need more production. I think that the kind of simple path that they were on has now been complicated, and they're going to have to focus on energy security as well as their climate objectives.
Dan, it's always such a treat having you with us. Thank you so much. That's Dan Jurgen of IHS Markit. Coming up, we take a look at how the markets are reacting today on news about Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We thought that the markets might be staging something like a rebound today, but now not so much. Here for an update is Kriti Gupta.
Yeah, well, it was supposed to be an easy day in the green, right? We saw a 1% decline in the S&P 500 yesterday. We saw a technical correction. We have seen a drop from its peak for the S&P 500 to 10%, closing yesterday at that 10% level. On an intraday basis, we had already dropped 10%. But that's really kind of why we saw a technical correction. Perhaps that would be the start of why futures actually were in the green and the stock market opened in the green. And then a reversal when it comes to that geopolitical risk, now hovering about flat. But if you see where there is some very key outperformance, it's in those cybersecurity stocks, which tells you that at the end of the day, it is still that geopolitical risk that is driving markets down broadly. But you also see pockets of green where you start to see that defensive hedge. We used to see that in oil companies. We saw that in defense companies. And today it happens to be cybersecurity companies.
Yeah, well, cybersecurity, no coincidence, because there's a lot of concern about cybersecurity. But what about the oil companies? How are they doing through all this?
Pretty well, actually, especially the ones that have extra exposure to American production in particular. So not your Chevrons or Exxons, which are more diversified companies, have more kind of exposure to other regions of the world. But it's the ones that are like more Marathon Oil, Apache, Halliburton, that have more of that American crude exposure that's actually following crude prices higher. And it's another story for wheat as well, I believe touching the highest since 2012. Once again, wow. Ukraine and Russia make together about 25% of the world's grain supply. Similar story for metals even.
Which takes us to Russia. How are Russian assets doing?
Not so well. And remember, those stocks are still kind of struggling. Remember, it is a holiday in Russia right now, but really where you're seeing a lot of the action is going to be in the ruble, testing that 80 level, which has been significant going all the way back to 2014 and 2016. What's important to keep in mind about the ruble here is that in 2014, when those sanctions were put on, they were also dealing with a collapse in oil prices. And although oil prices have rebounded, the ruble never recovered. And that's your very clear impact of those sanctions.
Yeah, at the same time, Vladimir Putin's gotten a lot of his assets in ruble denominated, so it's not dollar denominated, which helps.
Absolutely, ruble. And then if you look at the reserves, they're actually a lot of it's piled into things like the offshore renminbi, for example. Really a big effort to de-dollarize.
Okay, Kriti, really great report. Thank you so much. That's Kriti Gupta reporting on the markets. Coming up here, we're going to talk with the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Joel Rubin, about President Biden's move yesterday on sanctions and then what may be coming next. We have a new report on the Bloomberg on that subject. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Now we're going to keep you up to date on news from around the world with First Word, and that is with Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, David. New York Mayor Eric Adams wants the city to move in the next few weeks towards phasing out the proof of vaccination requirement for restaurants, bars, and other indoor spaces. Adams says he will continue to follow the science in deciding when the so-called vaccine passport rule will be eliminated. Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. have recently ended requirements to show proof of vaccination in indoor spaces. Hong Kong will expand mask wearing to all public places, including in parks and during outdoor exercise, as its latest outbreak worsens. In London, people will no longer be required to wear face coverings even on public transport. In a sign of how the pandemic is reshaping business travel, employees at HSBC on average racked up just 191 miles on work-related trips last year. That's down from more than 2,600 2 years before. The bank plans to keep a tight leash on travel even as rules ease. And the fortunes of Russia's super rich have fallen $32 billion this year, and sanctions from the conflict in Ukraine are likely to destroy even more wealth. Gennady Timchenko heads the list of Russian billionaires who've seen their fortunes drop. According to the Bloomberg billionaires list, almost a third of his wealth has disappeared this year. He now has a fortune of about $16 billion. And in Canada, banks froze about $6.1 million in just over 200 accounts under emergency powers meant to cut off funding to the organizers of a massive trucker protest over COVID restrictions. The trucks blockaded Ottawa for 3 weeks, and dozens remained gathered at encampments outside the city. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. So Ukraine is the story of the day and of the week for that matter. And we talked earlier on Bloomberg Television with a former U.S. ambassador to Moscow. He is Mr. John Teft.
I think sanctions, as a rule, are a very slow evolving process. You know, I go back even to my early days in the Foreign Service. I was in the 1970s working on Southern African policy, and we put sanctions in place there. And it took a long time for them to have their desired effect, isolating the country, isolating their economy, and building some pressure to make some change. Sanctions are the best thing we have now because the president and I think the American people do not want us to get into a fighting war with Russia over Ukraine. So you impose sanctions, you put pressure on them, and you punish them, but they're not necessarily designed to get a quick result to change the mind of Vladimir Putin, who is a tough guy and would never want to even be seen as doing it. That said, I think the foreign ministry statement is a little bit of they protest too much, methinks, because the sanctions that were imposed in 2014 have had an impact on the society and on the people around Putin. So they had an impact on the economy. And these new sanctions, not only the ones announced yesterday, but that will likely come, will also have an impact.
If that's the view on overall sanctions, what do you then make of sanctions that specifically target the high net worth individuals, the oligarchs of Russia? How effective are those at having the oligarchs maybe turn around and say to Putin, you need to back off?
I think Putin understands that these guys are getting punished for this. You know, there were lots of jokes when I was serving in Moscow about families or others going to South Beach in Miami or to the Côte d'Azur in France or similar places to these houses that these oligarchs had built for themselves and now not being able to go and visit their friends and family. I think it does sting, and it would really be a case-by-case basis to see how much it would hurt each individual businessman or oligarch economically. But I think they do, and they can protest a lot, but I think deep down, being confined to no travel to Europe or the United States is something quite significant for them in their lives.
Widening out the lens beyond sanctions, Ambassador, looking at just the way the Biden administration has approached this crisis and navigated it with our allies, do you think it has had success in doing so, to being a leader once again on the global stage?
Yes, I do. I think that President Biden and his team have done a good job of consulting with the allies and responding publicly. I think yesterday the sanctions that were announced, and your reporter was exactly right that there's more to be able to come. I think this was very carefully coordinated with our European allies.
That was John Teft. He's former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and Ukraine, speaking with Bloomberg earlier today. We're now going to continue on the subject of sanctions and turn to Joel Rubin. He served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under President Obama. So, Mr. Rubin, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. We just heard from the former ambassador to Russia, but in fairness to the ambassador, when he talked to Bloomberg, we didn't have the new report we just have out of Bloomberg now. There are going to be more sanctions perhaps imposed today on certain elites, they're described, close to Vladimir Putin, as well as on the company building Nord Stream 2. Give us the theory of these sanctions. Why is it effective to get to and affect Mr. Vladimir Putin by affecting the people around him?
Yeah, David, it's great to be with you. And these sanctions are tough and they're strong and they're targeted, and they're also going to impact the broader Russian economy. And the reason to your question that they're focused on the people directly around Putin, oligarchs, and his support network is because they're really twofold ideas. First, to harm these people directly and financially, to make sure they feel the pain. These sanctions will go after their children as well, who are oftentimes used as a front for the oligarchs, but also the political side, which is to tell the Russian people, look, these people who have been stealing money from you for decades upon decade, we're going after them too. And dividing a little bit there, the Russian people from the Russian oligarchs who are part of Putin's inside coterie, and saying that these people, they are persona non grata right now. And it is going to sting, as the ambassador had said, it's going to sting. And there are many more names on that list that the Treasury Department has at its disposal.
Do you think, Mr. Rubin, that we have a working hypothesis of what Vladimir Putin's strategy is right now? Does he have a strategy? Because in order to understand where we can get him to go, we have to sort of know where he thinks he's going.
Well, I've been talking to the administration quite a bit over the past several months about what they think Putin is thinking. And to be honest, they've laid it out in public as well, which is what Secretary Blinken said last week in the statement at the United Nations, which is Vladimir Putin is looking to reestablish spheres of influence for Russia. Some call it returning to the Soviet Union. It may be a little more 18th century-ish and just Russia as a nation trying to impose its will alongside its borders. But nonetheless, that seems to be where Putin is heading. And this illegal invasion is part of that, but it does not look like it's the end point. And so the administration is very focused on countering that by publicly disinfecting the air around Putin's language and saying this is where he's heading. And this has, as a result, helped our unity with our allies, helped with Germany, for example, in essentially killing the Nord Stream 2 project and telling Russia that they are alone, they are isolated. If they do continue on this path, it will be harmful to them.
Does it make sense to continue negotiations at this point? We know that, in fact, there's not going to be the meeting between the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of Russia now that was scheduled for tomorrow. Is there any point in talking at this point?
Well, there are two lanes of diplomacy right now in this avenue. We saw one over the weekend at the Munich Security Conference where the vice president was out there and speaking with our allies. Diplomacy matters, and yes, diplomacy will continue in the United States. We should be engaged, and we are engaged with our allies, not just in Europe, but around the world and in Asia and in the Gulf states in particular around energy questions. But when it comes to direct bilateral talks with the Russians, there have been talks ongoing for months. Certainly, those are useful if there is use to them. But I think that the decision was right by Secretary Blinken to say the utility of these discussions this week that were talked about, there is no utility because Russia continues to flagrantly violate norms and rules. And we can't have a discussion where Russia doesn't pull back its troops and engage in legitimate diplomatic dialogue. So that's a to be determined dynamic. And let's see if Russia gets the message and actually starts to hold back and engages legitimately in dialogue.
President Biden and Western allies of the United States are clearly trying to put pressure on President Putin. Time will tell whether that's effective. Thus far, it doesn't seem to have been. Are there other places maybe where pressure could be applied? And let me pick one out, which is President Xi in China. We saw President Xi appear with President Putin at the beginning of the Winter Games. They said they're really tied together. But I've noticed, as far as I can tell, they've sort of gone silent over the last few days. Are we sure that China is fully on board with what Russia's doing?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at China. First and foremost, the Chinese are looking at the American, the Western reaction to Russia's flagrant violations of international law. And they may be thinking twice about what this means for their decisions down the road in their neighborhood, in their region, maybe vis-a-vis Taiwan in particular. And it's concerning because this unity of purpose that we're seeing on display can also identify China if China goes in that direction. But separately, does China want to become allied with Russia alone and isolated as the sanctions continue to bite? That's not clear at all. China is a winner, though, right now with its deal with Russia, in that Russia is essentially subcontracting itself to China. It's making itself subordinate to Chinese economic support if these sanctions do go into full effect. So it's a very uncomfortable place for China to be, absolutely. And the global opinion, the more it comes down on Russia, the more that Russia is isolated, the more difficult it will be for China as well to stand toe-to-toe with Russia.
Okay, thank you so very much for being with us today. That's Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Coming up, we'll talk Vladimir Putin with the woman who wrote the book on him, Angela Stent from Georgetown University. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Russian President Vladimir Putin has certainly accomplished one thing with his actions on Ukraine. He has the whole world talking about what he is thinking. Welcome now an authority on Russia and particularly on Mr. Putin. Angela Stent is Professor Emerita at Georgetown University and author of the book Putin's World, Russia Against the West and Ahead with the Rest. So, Professor, thank you so much for being back with us. I guess I really do wonder what you make of what Vladimir Putin's doing right now. Does he have a strategy? What is his goal?
Well, you might want to tune in and listen to his 1-hour rant really from Sunday night, the diatribe against Ukraine, against the West, denigrating the Ukrainian people, attacking the United States and the West for trying to squeeze Russia and attack Russia. And you really wondered what, to quote the former German Chancellor Merkel, what world he's living in. And then we've seen more rhetoric from him yesterday, and obviously we have the so-called peacekeepers who have now gone into the regions of southeastern Ukraine, which Russia has now recognized as independent. I don't know what his strategy is, but we do know that he really wants to subjugate Ukraine. I mean, yesterday they issued demands and said Ukraine should become demilitarized. So he wants to have a subservient Ukraine. He wants to have a government in Ukraine that's pro-Russian. How he's going to do that, we're still waiting to see. How other troops, I mean, there's really already a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and there has been since 2014. But is he going to move further? Are they really going to try and take Kyiv? And beyond that, we do know that he wants to reestablish a sphere of influence. But I think the immediate goal, as I said, is the suppression of Ukraine.
You have really been a student of Vladimir Putin, the person, not just the president, but the person as well. Has he changed? Because I'm reading increasingly that he has changed. He is more isolated. He does not have as many advisors around him, certainly not people who would disagree with him. Do you think he's changed, in particular since 2014 when he went to Crimea?
Yes, I think he definitely has. And if you read accounts even of the people, the leaders who were visiting him in these past few weeks, he has gotten more paranoid. He's gotten angrier and angrier against the United States and the West for not listening to his demands and saying that Russia has legitimate interests. And I think it's gotten worse in the COVID period. He's been very isolated. It's very hard for people to see him. The Wall Street Journal today reported that President Macron, had he wanted to shake hands with President Putin a week or two ago, would have had to have arrived 7 hours early in Russia and had a PCR test only administered by a Russian doctor, with his own doctors not present. As you realize, he didn't shake Putin's hand. And he really has around him a group of 3 or 4 men, most of whom have come from the intelligence services. They reinforce all of his views. And the kind of people like Alexei Kudrin, the former finance minister, who understands very well that it's in Russia's interest to have a better relationship with the West if it wants its economy to grow and prosper. Those voices aren't heard anymore. I don't know whether President Putin is talking to kind of the economic elites, but he has this, I think, very narrow field of vision at the moment.
So, Angela, given that description of Vladimir Putin and who he is and where he's headed, usually I ask, what is the out for President Putin? Now I'm asking, what's the out for President Biden and the West? Because this sounds like conflict. We're headed toward conflict of one sort or the other, whether it's economic or something much more dangerous. Certainly we can't agree to demilitarize Ukraine. That reminds me of Sudetenland, and that didn't end up very well leading up to World War II.
I mean, there really is no out. Your previous guest was talking about, diplomacy. We've offered to sit down with the Russians and discuss a variety of issues connected to security, troop deployments, missile defenses, confidence building measures. They're really not interested in that. We've imposed some sanctions. I'm sure there will be more sanctions if this conflict increases. There's really not too much else we can do. We're not going to go to war with Russia. We can't. The United States and Russia are 2 nuclear superpowers. Europe isn't going to go to war with Russia. And we are just going to have to do whatever we can to bolster our NATO allies that border Ukraine and hope that the conflict doesn't spread to them, because that's almost unimaginable to think about what would happen then, and to try and help the Ukrainians as much as we can. But the sad reality is that they're on their own in this.
Wow. Okay. Very sobering, very helpful, but very sobering, I must say. That's Angela Stent, Professor Emerita of Georgetown University. Coming up here, Republicans weigh in on how President Biden is handling the Ukraine crisis, and it is a mixed bag. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. At times of international crisis, there was a tradition in the United States that we put aside partisan politics. And there's some of that this time around, as we heard from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell just yesterday.
Putin needs to learn out of this incident that he can't start grabbing pieces of other countries in order to rebuild what he would like to rebuild is something similar to the old Soviet Union. This is an invasion. There's some discussion about what's the definition of an invasion. This is an invasion. Number two, this should prompt immediate implementation of the toughest possible sanctions.
But then again, there are other Republicans who are not being quite as supportive. To talk about the U.S. politics we are seeing play out, we welcome now our political contributor, Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College. Jeannie, always wonderful to have you with us. One of the people I'm referring to, of course, is our most recent president, Donald Trump. I saw him yesterday come out and actually use the word genius in describing what he was seeing out of President Putin, saying he is very, very savvy. He knows him very well because essentially he's taken over part of the country and called peacekeepers he's sending in. What about that? Where is the Republican Party? Are they with President Biden or against him?
Well, we've seen this, split in the Republican Party. On the one hand, you have the old sort of traditional hawks and, Mitch McConnell echoing a bit of that. But certainly, John McCain represented that well for many, many years. And then you have this split into these more isolationist sort of Donald Trumpian, bring back, refocus on the United States, a more isolationist approach that we're hearing echoed in some of the Republican media, for instance. And, the challenge for Republicans is that it makes it difficult for them to really criticize Joe Biden should this thing go wrong for Joe Biden, if you have, on the other hand, these arguments coming out from people like Donald Trump. So splitting the party is not a good thing. You also have a split on the Democratic side, but it's not as pronounced.
Do we have a sense of how this plays politically, the extent to which Americans might be concerned? I mean, I haven't heard, for example, anyone point out that many times President Trump said things supportive of President Putin. We hear Mitch McConnell saying this is partly Joe Biden's fault because of the botched attempts to evacuate from Afghanistan. We don't hear people saying, but President Trump was pretty easy sometimes on President Putin.
And this is an argument that Democrats are going to have to come back with if they hear criticism against Joe Biden. Donald Trump has long been criticized for cozying up to Putin, cozying up to autocrats around the world. And, in the latest statements he made, sort of looking at what Putin is doing and talking about it in these sort of very positive terms, Democrats are going to have to come back at Republicans on this if they try to use it against Joe Biden. But again, this is not really good news for the Republican Party because it does split them heading into a midterm election in which all signs suggest that they should do very, very well. And to me, it has a little bit of echoes of 2020. They should have won those two Georgia Senate seats, but you had President Trump making statements and they ended up losing those. And they threatened to do that again, which is what I think people like Mitch McConnell are recognizing and responding to, taking a more traditional approach here. And, we'll have to see how it plays out in the midterm election. Yeah. But this split doesn't bode well for the Republicans. But
a point, Jeannie, you've made again and again, which is in the end, what you pay at the gas pump may be the thing that influences Americans more than anything else.
That's right. That's right. And Americans know what they're paying. And Joe Biden is going to really be on the losing end of that if prices keep going up as they are. I hope Republicans should let him suffer and not try to step in and monkey it up for themselves.
Okay. Thank you so much. Always great to have you with us. That's Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College, our political contributor here at Bloomberg. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. And in our second hour, we're going to talk with sanctions expert Professor Bruce Gentleson of Duke. This is Bloomberg.